Did you ever hear that from Dropout?
Oh, yes, I did see that.
You're a
Yes.
regular person. No, you're a regular guy. You can brush your teeth.
Hey, so
Hey, so this is hey, so
you know the discourse about I propose there but mere pale imitations.
and yet, granted, you are so right on this. I've never seen it, but now I cannot unsee it. Key pipe, they're a little too big to truly fall into the little glasses part.
Yeah.
But Grant, yeah.
Indiana Jones, there's it for.
But young Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
If you did it now, it would have
No,
worked.
no.
But now, it really is. You need to post that. You think these two pioneered it? No. Brilliant, Grant.
Just get far away.
Not as much as work.
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, probably. I don't know when I want to go back to the office. I think that'll be. Well, I did. They gave me a blank check recently. That's how much time I have.
To be fair, how do you tell the guy who literally has cancer? Sorry, you can't. Like, I feel like there is such stigma there. Like, we literally cannot tell you no.
You do whatever I want. You make a new friend? Yeah.
It's also, there's no real reason for him to
Yeah. It's
it
also
loses us nothing.
yeah, it's also the job that is even at the office. I'm even I'm even talking to everybody in the office the same time. Doing our chats.
Like, where are they going? I literally have got Apple, but I keep forgetting to put it in. The chocolate Starlight from our child. The only thing better are butterscotch.
Hi, Terry.
I'm not. I like this movie. Those hit different though. Those are soft somehow. I don't know what they put in theirs, but they are soft.
Al, here in a heartbeat, would you lead us in a word of prayer? All right. So, passing out a new book. You're looking at your book that you have right now for tonight, and you're saying, Brian, we still have one more class. And yet I'm passing out a book to start next week. Did you know that if you try to schedule your quarter with 13 weeks for every quarter, every other year you end up with 12 weeks on one? And if you're not paying attention, you get surprised. So I got surprised. So next week we'll move we'll finish. Tonight will be the last class. Lamar doesn't know yet. He's sick tonight. He won't be here. But Lamar is going to find out he doesn't have a class next week. So we can all let him know that he can do like April 31st or something. Something like that. It's good to see all of you tonight. I do have new books for us. So they're also online if you prefer to use it that way. And I think the only person that I didn't get a book to is my number one mother-in-law. So, oh, she has one. Okay. Whew. So I'm okay there. I'm all right. No, that's right. You've got that book. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about a couple of people that fitting into our study and talking about people who are, we say, minor characters in the Bible. Doesn't mean they're not important. They're actually really important. And tonight we're going to be talking about Priscilla and Aquilah. Before we get started, though, Al, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Dear Lord, as we come before your throne of grace at this time, we thank you, Lord, for another opportunity to gather with brothers and sisters. We thank you, Lord, for opportunities like this. Please open our minds and help us put our thoughts and worries aside and be with Brian as he presents the class so we can all participate and learn and have something that we can apply from this lesson to our lives. Please be with all our members, Lord, that are not able to be with us tonight, that are homesick and traveling. Please watch over them and be with their caregivers and help Lamar help them to get home safely from their travels. Be with our kids that are in college, Idaho, Florida, McMinnville. Be with them that they can learn from their college days, but not be pulled away from the church like we've seen over the years. Help them to be strong in their faith. Please be with each one of us with our faith, that we don't let that sit aside and have a moment of lack of faith, that where we might act out and do something that is out of character for us. Help us to always be vigilant and strong. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Al. Thank you very much. So tonight we're going to be in the book of Acts to start off. So I want you to grab your Bibles, and we're going over to the book of Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. And we're going to get started off here in a second. I'm going to pick on Gregor. Gregor, would you read for us? I'm going to just have you jump all over the book of Acts. You're going to start in Acts 18, verses 1 and 2, and then I'm going to have you jump to verses 18 and 19, 24, 25, and 26. Does that sound good, Gregor?
Oh, that sounds marvelous.
Excellent. So we're going to be looking at tonight. We're going to learn about Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla and Aquila. Gregor, whenever you're ready.
Okay. 1 and 2, and then jump down to...
Jump down to 18 and 19, 1 and 2, then 18, 19, and then 24, 25, 26.
Okay. Acts chapter 18. I'll be reading from the... No, I'm not. I'm not going to read from that version.
He was going to do the Greek version, by the way. That would have been exciting.
New King James. Okay. And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. 18 and 19.
Actually, would you go ahead and read verse 3? I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. I should have said 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation, they were tent makers. And he reasoned them
18, 19.
So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Caesarea, where he had taken a vow, and he came to Ephesus and left them there. And he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay longer with them, he did not consent. 24.
All right, 24, 25, 26.
Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross to Acacia, the brethren wrote exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through his grace.
So here we're introduced to a couple, Priscilla and Aquila. Sometimes people, and you might have read it in our book, sometimes people wonder why sometimes Priscilla is mentioned first and then Aquila. I like the way the author dealt with it. He says, I don't think it's much of a big deal. It just seems like Paul is just because he goes back and forth. It doesn't really have any significance. I've seen some people try to make a lot of significance out of this. And we meet them in verses 1 and 2, and we find out that they are, it says that Aquila was from Pontus. Pontus, by the way, is northern Turkey. So it's the area in northern Turkey today. But they lived in Rome, and it makes this statement that the that the Roman ruler had expelled them. By the way, a little side note, it's an interesting story that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. The Romans write about this, and they say that the Jews were causing a lot of consternation, and the writer says it was all because of this guy named Chrestus, which we think was actually Christ, that we think maybe he didn't know the name of Jesus, so he was just saying that they were all arguing about this person Chrestus. And so the Roman solution was just get rid of all of the Jews from that area. By the way, just a little in this chapter, you read about a guy named Gallio who does the same thing. He says, I'm not interested in Jewish debates, and he puts everybody out. So we meet them. They lived in Rome. They're put out. What was their profession? Tent makers, yeah, tent makers. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Sewing. Are you buying cloth? Are you sewing it together? I didn't look into too much what an ancient tent maker might have been like, other than it had to be somebody who was had dexterity and had some skill in putting things together. So I think that's kind of interesting. But it says they are tent makers by their trade. They kind of live all over the place, so I've always thought maybe they were very successful in some ways if they have several different businesses, because we're meeting them here first in Corinth, is where Paul runs into them. Sounds like they're already Christians from the conversation that we're having here. So Paul he moves in with them and he stays with them. Now, as this is Paul's second missionary journey, and as Paul is traveling around here, he ultimately ends up going on to Ephesus, and they follow him. I think it's kind of interesting that they go with him to Ephesus. So he goes along there, and they stay there in Ephesus while Paul then moves on, and he starts to head back to Jerusalem. So while they're staying there in Ephesus, the last thing we read about is that they meet this guy who was a disciple of John the Baptist. His name was Apollos. And Apollos was speaking boldly, it says, in the synagogue. Priscilla and Aquila pull him aside and say, hey, let's explain to you a little more accurately the things that you're talking about. And so we could say they converted him, and that they brought him to the Lord, brought him to be faithful. And then they kind of helped send him on his way, it sounds like, as he became a preacher, most likely in Corinth, actually, the place where they started at the beginning of this chapter. And so this is our critical information about Priscilla and Aquila. What's more interesting, though, are the little side notes that Paul has to say about them in some of his letters. So we'll look at those here for a moment. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul is writing from Ephesus to the church in Corinth, and kind of interesting, that's where Priscilla and Aquila had been, and they had come with him to Ephesus. He says, the churches in Asia greet you. He says, Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house. So we always sometimes kind of make a point. We talked about this in several of the books we've studied, that it's interesting when you had a church that met in somebody's house. We see that Jerusalem had something like that. We see Rome had several homes that had churches in them. And interestingly enough, one of those homes later is Priscilla and Aquila, that Paul writes in Romans 16 to the people that are in Rome, and he talks about Priscilla and Aquila. It seems like they've come back to Rome. He says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. And then he gives this little tidbit. He says, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the church that is in their house. So when they were in Ephesus, they hosted a church in their home, and now here in Rome, they're also letting a church meet in their home. So interesting that they've gone back to Rome. Now, Paul's last letter is 2 Timothy, and he's writing to Timothy, and we're pretty sure Timothy must be in Ephesus, and we get this statement about Priscilla and Aquila, that they're back in Ephesus now. And so as Paul is in Rome here, and he's at the end of his life, he talks at the beginning of the book about, the fact that he's going to die soon, and he's aware of that. But here he's kind of pointing out that they're back again. There's some things about Priscilla and Aquila that are really worth diving into. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to kind of pull out 3 characteristics, but maybe you'll have some other things you want to point out as well about Priscilla and Aquila, and what it is about them that is so important. The title of the chapter is A Marriage That Works for the Lord. And it's an interesting point to say that this is the idea not of a marriage that works, it does work, but a marriage that works for the Lord. And so we'll talk for a couple of minutes about that. Second thing we're going to talk about is hospitality. I'd like to spend a lot of our time talking about hospitality because I think it's one of those things that's super important that maybe we don't talk about a lot. And I think Priscilla and Aquila are really great for us to consider this important work, the work of hospitality. Then finally, one of the points that's made here is about the idea of Priscilla and Aquila being people that were really evangelistic. There's a couple of ways we might look at that in some of their work here, and I think it's just an interesting thing for us to consider what they thought of as being important. So we're going to be talking about those things tonight. So start us off talking about this idea of Priscilla and Aquila as husband and wife. Don't really have a lot of insight there. We don't know if they have children. We don't know, other than they both seem to have the same job. They work together. So the first question that was given to us is this: why is it important that a husband and wife be in agreement on spiritual matters? Sometimes I think this might be an overly easy question, but I also think maybe there's some things that we flush out of this that are kind of critical, like what does it mean to be in agreement on spiritual matters? What kind of answers do you have for this? What was your thoughts on this? Who's got something to share? George, go ahead.
A house that's in turmoil is not going to be able to accomplish what Aquila and Priscilla accomplished.
So George points out, he says, the house in turmoil. Jesus said a house that is divided cannot stand. That's one of the passages that it references there. So that's certainly something worth considering. What does it mean for somebody to be in agreement on spiritual matters? Go ahead, Grant.
I was just to say, I think that this can, you can take this a little bit further than just both a husband and wife should be Christians together. But you can also say, not only that, but they should agree on what their spiritual goals are together too. All right.
What would that's a good comment, Grant. So what would be spiritual goals that a husband and wife should be able to agree on or should think about agreeing on? I'll tell you what. Years ago, Mrs. Haynes, can I pick on you? She says I do. I should. Years ago, Wendy and I talked about if I become a preacher or not. That was something that we both had to agree on. That we both had to talk about. Why? Because, it would be as much Wendy's sacrifice as, well, it would be mostly Wendy's sacrifice, to do this work. And so we had to talk very heartily about that. And Wendy, you were all for it, right? She would shake her head silently and say, no. When I met Wendy, she said, I heard you preach once or twice, you're good at it, but I will not be a preacher's wife. Because she said that's a hard job. It's a difficult thing. It is tough, and sometimes we just don't appreciate the idea that somebody says, "Hey, I want to do this great service for God," but your spouse maybe isn't thinking the same thing. What do? Well, you're supposed to work things out with your spouse. You're supposed to dwell with them in an understanding way, and a lot of times that means maybe the big idea that I have, I'm going to have to set aside in order to fulfill the purpose that's right in front of me. Which do you think, kind of a tough question, which do you think is more important for Brian? To live with his wife in an understanding way, or to be an evangelist? To live with his wife, you're right. Because that's the first job that's given to me. If I take on an additional job of being an evangelist, well, that's an additional job I take on, or a deacon, or an elder, or a teacher. But first and foremost, I have taken on the role to be a husband, to be a father. You could add that to it as well. And so it's important that we appreciate and understand that those are works. And by the way, don't miss this idea that being a husband, being a father, being a mother, being a wife, that's the Lord's work. That's the assignment that God has given you to accomplish, to fulfill, and it glorifies God. And so a lot of times we miss the idea and think, well, I've got to be a great teacher, I've got to be a great, elder, deacon. But really, fundamentally, first of all, I need to fulfill the roles that I have in front of me. I'm going to come back to some things that in our questions that I might take some of the questions that are presented a different way towards the end there, but something to think about where it is that my first obligations lie. And that's the point there. Grant, you have a comment? Yeah.
I hadn't raised my hand, but I do have a comment. I was thinking for, Priscilla and Aquila, one of the big things that we see them doing that would have been something they needed to be in agreement on was where they were going all over the place to be servants of the church.
Right. So one of the things we're going to talk about in a moment is to be servants of the church. Let's say they're going to bring the whole church in their home. What do you think that entails, to bring the whole church into your home?
It's a lot of work.
It's A lot of it. Yeah, it's a lot of work, right? And you know, for those of us who have ever had to have, you know, even just having the church meet in our home briefly, you know, one time can be a lot of work. But you know, to do it constantly, to constantly be bringing people in, you know, Brian likes to shoo people out around 9 or 10 at night, right? But I think of the idea in Acts chapter 12, where they're meeting at a home in Jerusalem. It's the middle of the night, and they're still there praying. That's a lot, you know. That's a Mrs. Haynes, we got to get these people out of here kind of thing, I would think. But get the idea that they had to be in an agreement to say, yeah, this is important to both of us. Whenever you take on a stressful, hard thing, you'd better be in agreement on it. Because if you're not, what's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to break apart. You know, the fault there, the disagreement there is going to cause a lot of problems. So that's certainly something to think about here. Spiritual agreement, this agreement on spiritual matters, it needs to be the kind of thing that maybe we don't always see exactly eye to eye. You know, if you've talked to Mrs. Haynes more than 10 minutes, you'll hear her say, I don't always see things the way Brian sees it, but she understands what I think. And I think that's one of the things to say. She says, well, you understand it. I would say she respects it. I respect. She has some different views on spiritual matters that I think, oh, I don't know about that. But I respect it, and I acknowledge it, and you know, I understand it, and I've made it my goal to understand it, and that's how we achieve unity in the church. And so many of these things apply not just to a marriage that works for spiritual things, but a body, a church body that's going to work together. We have to both respect one another and understand what our perspectives are on things that, like we're talking about on Sunday morning, that might fit into the Romans 14 category as we've been talking about that. Anybody else have any comments on this first question? First, any other comments? You're a little nervous to comment on this one because you're not sure what might be. Occurred to me, though, and this wasn't one of the questions in our handout, but it occurred to me, you know, what would a marriage be like, though, that was successful, but it wasn't successful for the Lord? What do you think a marriage like that might look like, Brian?
I don't know if it's a good match, but maybe you remember Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, they were both in sync, weren't they? That's a great example, Ryan. Ryan says Ananias and Sapphira. They were in sync. They were, you know, but they weren't successful for the Lord. Ryan, I would say that one of the things we consider about what makes a marriage successful is the idea that it's the sense that we are enabling each other for better things. It might be the case that two people could be married, they can be happy, they can, enjoy each other, but if they're not enabling one another to stronger spiritual growth, and that's not always easy, then they're really not successful for the Lord. You know, it should be the kind of thing where, I'll say this carefully, we provoke one another to better things. Now, you know, Wendy would say, well, Brian, you provoke me a lot, but it's supposed to be, I provoked, and she provokes me to better things. To being a better servant, to being a stronger servant, to being more spiritual. And so those are all things that we want to consider. Anybody else have a thought about what that could be like? To be successful, but not successful for the Lord. So like I said, I think there's a lot of times where people just look at whether or not a couple stay married as the only mark of success. And I would say that that's certainly not true. And Ananias and Sapphira are a great example of what that looks like. Well, I said I just wanted to spend just a brief amount of time on this before jumping ahead to talk about one of the things that I think they're best known for, and that is for the work of hospitality. Hospitality. We're supposed to be hospitable, right? Here's a couple of Bible passages to think about. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2, we're given this command: do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. By the way, who do you think they're talking about here? Abraham? Anyone else? Sarah. Yeah, Sarah. Yeah, Sarah, Abraham.
Job? Not Job.
It's a three-letter word with an L in the middle. You're right.
What's his name?
Starts with an L.
Lot.
Ends with "ot." Yeah.
Lot.
Yeah, I knew you knew it because I would have said Job too. I knew exactly who you're thinking of. Yeah, so Lot, same story. Kind of a neat story. I think about this passage a lot, by the way. We have a visitor shows up in our congregation, and you know, I'm not necessarily going to discount the fact that it could literally mean what it's saying. That it could be, that there's a test here of some kind going on, that we're, that the visitor among us might be, performing for us. It's a remarkable thing. Here's Romans chapter 12, verse 10, and then jumping ahead to verse 13, talking about the life of a Christian. And he says, you're to be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love. And then he concludes that by saying, you're distributing to the needs of the saints, and you are given to hospitality. Given to hospitality. The Greek word for hospitality is philoxenos, which means the love of a stranger, somebody that you don't know, you demonstrate and you act on their behalf for. I always like to say that hospitality is very simply an open door. It's the idea that my home is open, that, I bring people into that home, that I'm willing to share my home and my food and things like that with others. Who is supposed to be hospitable in the Bible by characteristic? Who? And I see you looking at me funny thinking that didn't make sense. Elders, yeah. So one of the qualifications of an elder is supposed to be hospitable. Their home's supposed to be open for people. There's supposed to be people like that. Widows that receive support from the church are to be hospitable, the Bible says, and have shown hospitality to the saints. So here's another statement about this. Hospitality in the Old Testament, probably our best example of that is somebody like Abraham or Lot. When you think back to Genesis and you think of Abraham showing the hospitality to the strangers that showed up at his door, what do you remember specifically about what he did? What kind of things did he do? Anybody remember?
He laid a great feast out.
Yeah, he lays a feast out for him. He tells Sarah, hey, we're going to get all the good food, get everything, kill a calf, get it ready to go.
Well, also, I don't remember if he did this, but many times in the Bible times, they took care of their basic needs.
Yeah.
Washed their feet.
That
kind of thing.
Yeah, washing their feet is a great example of what this might look like. So he goes out there. By the way, did they come to Abraham and say, hey, we need a place to stay today? What was Abraham? Do you remember? Abraham saw them wandering outside and ran out and grabbed them and said, you guys need to come in. And he actually offered them the hospitality. They didn't ask for it. He offered it to them. Kind of interesting how in these ancient cultures, the hospitality had a very distinct mindset and, the idea of what Abraham is willing to do. How about Lot? In the next chapter in Genesis, Lot offered the same angels hospitality. What did he do?
He was actually waiting at the gate. It seemed to be maybe even possibly waiting in case strangers came to the town.
And what did he do for them?
Well, he took them in and then he protected them.
Yeah, he told them, you're not sleeping outside here tonight. It's not a good idea. Come in my home. Come stay in my home. So we had a place for him to stay. So hospitality in the Old Testament. Anybody think of any other Old Testament examples? Ryan, you got a comment. Go ahead.
The New Testament, actually.
Oh, go for the New Testament. We got...
it was really 1 Peter 4:9, the warning not to grumble about being hospitable.
All right, we're going to be there in here in just a second because that's actually a question for us about this. So Ryan, that's a good observation. We'll be there here in just a moment. New Testament hospitality. I put Mary and Martha when I was thinking about people, and Mary and Martha, Martha was working in the kitchen. Mary was sitting with Jesus, and Martha kind of felt like it was inhospitable for Mary not to be getting things ready. It's more of an example about what's important, but it's also a nice example of hospitality, of the idea of how in the New Testament they were very distinct. There's another good example of hospitality in the New Testament, kind of maybe an unusual one. I was thinking Matthew. What are you thinking? When Matthew brought Jesus?
Yeah, well, wasn't Matthew the one that was the tax collector?
Yes.
And he had the tax collectors over.
Yeah, so when Matthew is invited by Jesus, he brings Jesus to his home, and then he brings all of his tax collector friends to his home too. That's actually a really good example. I was thinking of like that as well. How about the Good Samaritan? Yeah, there's another one where it's interesting that he showed hospitality, but it wasn't his home. He takes him to an inn and he pays for, but he does, pour oil on his wounds. And, we talked last Sunday about James 5 and pouring oil, and oil was a, kind of a comfort substance as well as a cleaning substance to use.
So does Zacchaeus count?
Zacchaeus was another one that he said, I'm going, but Jesus said what?
Jesus said, I'm coming.
Jesus said, I'm coming to your house today. And Zacchaeus invites all his friends over, and they say, well, this is where they say, well, if they knew what kind of guy Zacchaeus was. So, very interesting.
Couldn't hospitality be also the widow that took care of
Elijah.
Elijah?
Yeah. That's nice. I didn't think about that one. That's a really good example. I wish I thought about that one because that's a really good example of hospitality. Her last meal. Her last meal. Yeah. So we see that there's. Go ahead. Go.
Sorry, I was going to say like in Acts chapter 2 and 3, it seems like the Jews in Jerusalem were showing hospitality to all the Christians who were there for Passover.
Excellent point. I didn't think about them, but that's an excellent point. That in other words, these Christians in Acts 2 and 3, having come there without enough to be taken care of, they had to be provided for. Last week we talked about Barnabas selling some of his land, to help take care of those Christians. So a lot of good examples for us. Ananias and Sapphira, how did they show hospitality? Acts chapter 18, verses 1 and 2. What was it that they did? Yeah, Paul moved in with them, Paul moved in with them, and that's kind of interesting.
It seems like they hired Paul.
Yeah, it might be the case that they hired Paul. Kind of as an aside to this, here's an interesting little thing. In Acts chapter 9, Peter moves in with somebody. Anybody remember who Peter moved in with? Or in Joppa? His name was Simon. He was Simon the Tanner. Simon the Tanner. I was going to say, what do tanners do? But they tan. What did tanners work with? Dead animals and excrement. And a lot of times their houses had to be outside of town. So I've always thought it's interesting that Peter lived with somebody that smelled terrible, And I actually think that that's meant to lead us into Acts chapter 10 when Peter is invited to the house of somebody that he thinks is unclean. A tanner was a lot of times considered ceremonially unclean because he handled animals, he handled, these things that you tan. They're, I don't want to get graphic, but they are tough things. And yet Peter moved in with them. I've always found that fascinating. And it's interesting that the tanner could have said, the apostles don't want to live with me. My house stinks. It's, but you never know. So don't be that person that says, I can't offer hospitality. I don't have anything worth offering because Simon the Tanner had a good job. George, did I see your hand up?
I was just going to add the stinky chemicals that a tanner uses.
Yeah.
They really smell bad.
Yeah, they're awful. They're awful. Like I said, they used a lot of things that, I don't want to be graphic, but they used some pretty harsh things. So it's very interesting to think of what that would have been like for Peter to have done that. The other thing to say is that they hosted, sounds like 2 congregations in their home. We already Debbie mentioned already about how difficult that can be to bring a congregation in your home and to prepare everything for them and such. And, it might be the case that you were expected to squeeze the grapes, to make the fruit of the vine and to bake the bread. And, that there might have been a lot of expectations we just don't appreciate. Of how much work it could be to bring the church in a home. And they did it twice. So a couple of things to think about. So let's talk about hospitality for a couple of minutes. How does modern hospitality differ than biblical times? If Dave comes over to my house and I say, Dave, I got a bucket of water. I'm here to wash your feet. Dave, are you going to walk out? No, you wouldn't. I might. If I go to Al's and he says, I'm going to wash your feet, I'm going to say, I've got to go. I don't know that I'd feel comfortable about that. How's it different? What's the difference today versus 2,000 years ago?
See, I feel like a lot of the kind of ancient hospitality, the reason they put so much emphasis on it was because there was people were a lot poorer and there wasn't a guarantee that a person would have, a place to sleep or food to eat. Whereas today, here in the United States at least, we tend to be pretty confident that, everybody here, if I don't feed them dinner, they're not going to go home hungry.
Right. That's a really good example because honestly, if we had a traveler show up and somebody said, hey, I'm here Sunday, I'm from Michigan, our assumption would be that you're well provided to be able to continue on your journey. We wouldn't even think, unless they mentioned it to us, we wouldn't say, well, do you have enough gas? Do you have we would assume you wouldn't have made a journey without that. So there's a very strong presumption for the ability today, financial ability of people. So that's good. George?
I was just gonna say, even in the early days of this country, people's doors were open. If you needed a place to stay, like you said, you don't even have to ask, they know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point of how that has changed. And one of the things that, our society has changed is that we probably don't feel as safe in some ways to people that are, that have different needs. So that might be part of it as well. What else do you think? Anything else, Wendy?
Well, I just find it very interesting because, I've also been reading Jane Austen, so it's kind of the same that our society today is so different, even at that time and at this time. When you went and visited someone, you stayed for weeks in their house. And unless we're going to visit family and, you don't have that anymore. You don't show up at someone's house or they invite you to come stay a month with them.
Yeah.
Like here, Paul lived with them, like Peter, that seemed very normal, even up through the 18th century.
Yeah, months and months probably, at least, that Paul was with them in Corinth.
I'm thinking no one wants to live with us.
That's right, yeah, I don't know what it is. What? Wendy, yeah.
I think another thing is that we are also a very money-focused society, and we kind of have a tendency to want to solve all our problems by just putting money in that direction to say, not come over to my house and stay with me, but hey, go get a hotel room instead. We don't want to give up our own things that we have.
What do you think about that?
Do that. I think it's a negative thing.
Okay. Okay. I'm not sure. Like I said, I think I can see why somebody might say it's a negative, that we're not as quick. But on the other hand, I can see where somebody might appreciate on the other side of that too, to say, well, if I sometimes do a gospel meeting somewhere, sometimes I'll stay at somebody's house, and sometimes I say, hey, we got you a hotel room, and they're both nice. They're both nice. So it's interesting, win and lose something there. Anybody else? Debbie, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the big differences in then and now is back then, if somebody rode a donkey, you were also expected to put the donkey out.
Oh, that's true.
It wasn't just the person. With us, they drive a car, and so they just park it in the driveway or the street or
right.
visitor parking or whatever. But that was providing for their animals at the same time.
Right.
And then now we don't have that. And thinking about whether you put them up in your home or in a hotel, I think back then privacy wasn't such a big deal.
Right.
If you have, if all your bedrooms are full with family, that live there all the time, you don't, I think now, before, like Jane Austen type, you just shove more people in the bedroom. It just wasn't a big deal. But now I think we kind of hold our privacy a little more and say, I don't have room in my home, but let me help you get a hotel or something like that. And I think that's just the way we feel here in this country, especially.
I want to make this point based on what Debbie said. It is hospitality when I open my home and somebody stays with me. But from the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's also hospitality if I put somebody up. We would say either one is hospitality. So, hospitality is having a love for that person, which is to say we want the best for them. We want to see to their needs. But at the same time, I think we do have a little more personal connection sometimes when people stay with us, and they're shall I say exposed to our living arrangement and our circumstances. And I think there's something special about that too. How was it that moving forward, how did Paul benefit from their hospitality? What do you have there?
He got a job.
Yeah, he got a job. Yeah, George.
Paul's a good preacher.
Yeah.
They can learn a lot.
They probably learned quite a bit from Paul, didn't they? Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Paul said they put their neck on the line for me. But I don't know when Paul is talking about. I don't know if Paul is talking about here when he got to Corinth and they put him up, or some other circumstance. I'm not sure what Paul means when he says these are people that I owe a lot to. I could see maybe if they provided for him in a time where he didn't have a lot of provision, that would be great. he says all the churches of the Gentiles owe them a great deal. And I think that's interesting. I don't know what they did, but something happened. Josie, what do you think?
When Paul would go to a new town, he would go to the synagogues, right?
Yeah.
And preach there, and not everybody agreed with him.
That's right.
And most of them, or some of them, probably even plotted to get rid of him.
Yeah.
So if he was being associated with Priscilla and Aquila, then maybe they were in danger too of being associated with him or something.
Very interesting point that in Acts chapter 18 we see that the Jews rose up. It says in verse 12 that the Jews rose up and tries to cause some problems there. And right after that is when Paul and Priscilla and Aquila all left. So they all three left at the same time. So that could be part of it too. George has already mentioned that maybe some of the benefit that they received was they might have had a lot to learn from Paul, and so that's a good thing. One more question about hospitality, or two more questions about hospitality. One of them is, how does modern hospitality help the cause of Christ? What is the benefit here to Christ? Hospitality. It probably it's kind of obvious, to say that by Jesus giving us the parable of the Good Samaritan, and Jesus trying to describe what is it to love your neighbor, which is the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus uses the Good Samaritan as the story there. And the Good Samaritan is in large part a story about hospitality. So we could say that hospitality could be one of the core principles of revealing ourselves to Christ. Anybody have a thought on that? Gerald, what do you got?
I was just thinking it also gives that person a chance to exposure of our way of living.
Yes, yeah. Gerald, I like to say it's good to see what's in my refrigerator. Now, what I mean by that is that it's good for people to see the way, if I'm trying to live Christ-like, it's good for them to see that. And they don't open up the fridge and there's 30 gallons of booze in there, or there's all sorts of things. What they see is the way I live. Bringing somebody in my home is an opportunity for them to, go through my medicine cabinet. Is an opportunity for them to, to see, how do I really talk to my, family, my wife, my children, and things like that. It's an opportunity, the Bible says to be an example in all things, and it's really an opportunity for that.
Teaching.
Yeah, it really is. It really is, Gerald. Gregor and then Grant.
Well, and hospitality to me seems like it's just a sign of unconditional love, because you're offering these services with no qualms, no charge, no anything. I mean, the Good Samaritan's a prime example. He had no cause to help that other person. He had none.
Right.
And yet, he did it unconditionally and who knows what the guy at the inn did when he said, I'll pay for a week, and if you need more, I'll be coming back this way, I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
And that's just total unconditional, let's make sure this man's taken care of.
Nice.
And, what better demonstration of unconditional love than letting somebody who you may or may not know into your home?
Excellent point, Gregor. Really good point. Grant and then Ron.
I think hospitality is one of those things that everybody in the world sees as being a very good thing to do, a very selfless thing to do.
Yeah.
So when we, show ourselves showing hospitality, we're, being an example of Christ to the world that the world looks well on and says, hey, those people are doing something good.
Yeah. It's interesting because the reverse testimony, if we didn't take care of our own, let's say, Paul makes the statement in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that if we don't provide, now he's talking about your personal family members, but let's say if we're not as a church taking care of our members, he says it's worse than an unbeliever. What he's suggesting is the idea that the whole world recognizes that this is a good thing. Paul says in Romans 12, do what is right in the sight of all men. And this is definitely one everybody respects.
And the world is quick to hop on the hypocrisy when we don't.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Right?
I was thinking about James 1:27, honoring the orphan and the widow.
Right.
Well, that's going to have to be hospitality.
Right.
They don't have anyone else to turn to.
Right. And he says that's pure and undefiled religion. That's the heart of what real religion is about.
I don't know if this would be part of hospitality or not, but when we have a visitor come in, if we just ignore that visitor, what does that do to help the cause of Christ?
Right.
We have gone to congregations where
Yes.
we've been ignored.
Yeah.
And you don't feel like you ever want to go back when you're
Right.
visiting again. But so we have to show that love of the stranger. So maybe it is hospitality to someone who walks in our door that we've never met before.
Agreed.
Even if we have met them before, we need to show some, kindness to them, and that just helps them know that we love Christ, and that I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say the
Well,
rest of
well,
what
you're
I'm
saying something important. By the way, we have a visitor tonight, and if we all don't give him $5 each, he'll go off and let us know that. I think, my opinion, is that the way a congregation treats a visitor is probably one of the chief thermometer measurements of their spiritual ability. That, in other words, the person who comes in, does it reflect that they're hungry? If this person's not a believer, are they hungry for souls? Are they desirous for opportunities to do what's right? Like Debbie said, I too have been in congregations where, I don't think they really cared for me to be there one way or the other. We should be thrilled when visitors show up. We should act thrilled. We should act like, hey, it's a big deal that you're here. We're excited you're here. It should be something that compels us. The worst thing that churches fall into is a cliquish, you know what I mean by a clique, right? A cliquish attitude where, well, I talk to the people that I talk to every week. Those are my people, and I just kind of keep that group. And that is definitely the sign of a church that has a problem, that has something it needs to fix. And visitors are definitely the litmus test. There's the word I was looking for. The litmus test of whether or not we are spiritually successful in this very, very important work. One more. We're going to run out of time. We're going to get to our third point. Ryan, I'm throwing this one at you because you brought us to it a minute ago. You and I know what you were thinking. You were thinking about where he says, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. What's the instruction? What's the admonition here, and why is it this way?
A lot of people have the temptation that their house has to be perfect, and it's just a huge hassle to have people over, and they don't want people over. It's just big inconvenience.
So, and what are they doing, Ryan? When they have people over, they are grumbling and complaining. Grumbling and complaining, Al?
Well, back then when people came over to be hospitable, they didn't just come for dinner. They came for days.
Yeah.
And then you're grumbling because you're having to feed them, and when are they leaving?
Yeah.
He's encouraging them to not grumble at this point.
Yeah.
We don't even invite them to our home anymore. We just say, we'll meet you at BJ's, La Sierra.
Right.
We take them somewhere.
Right.
But having someone into our home, that's really changed.
I think what's interesting is an Acts chapter 2 kind of church where what if, suddenly we have two members that sold their house and they haven't got a new house yet and they're homeless and they need to move in with somebody for months, Acts chapter 2 for years. How anxious or excited would we be to say, all right, I'm going to open my home. I'm going to, set up this spare room for them, and this is going to be their room and their bathroom. And I was making a great point to say it is a little, bit of a challenge. And after a while, used to know a preacher who said, I always get a guest bed that's only good for 3 days. And he said that way at the end of that, they're ready to go. But that's not good enough. It's not good enough. We're at our time. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about evangelism. Just to say, though, Priscilla and Aquila, they were people that worked to teach. They worked to establish churches. And I really think it's really remarkable to say, to think about some of the ways that they did things, that the whole church was supported by them, that the whole congregation was supported by them and their work. And this was a question I didn't like, and I wanted to talk more about this, but I just want to say Priscilla and Aquila, they uplifted the local church, and they uplifted the people that served in the church. It's really clear. And Paul says, and if you're a Gentile church, and that's kind of what we are, he says, you owe them a lot of things. So we owe them a lot of things. Thanks.